In the evening of the following day, the door of Marx's house was opened. He was not at home. Only Mrs. Marx and Lenchen and Barthélemy entered, bowing stiffly and replying with a sepulchral voice to the anxious question, "What news?" "Schramme unveiled dans la tête." Schramme has a bullet in his head, whereupon bowing stiffly once more he turned and withdrew. You may imagine the fright of the half-insensible lady. She knew now that her instinctive dislike had not deceived her. 1 hour later, she related the sad news to us. Of course, we gave up Schramme for lost. The next day, while we were just talking about him sadly, the door was opened and in came with a bandaged head but gaily laughing the sadly mourned one, and related that he had received a glancing shot which had stunned him. When he recovered consciousness, he was alone on the seacoast with his second and his physician. Willich and Barthélemy had returned from Ostend on the steamer which they had just been able to reach. With the next boat Schramme followed. A split was unavoidable, particularly as Willich had, on his own authority, summoned a general meeting of the London members of the League. Marx therefore resigned from the Refugee Committee and opened the final meeting of the Central Committee, held on September 15, with a long speech from the chair containing 3 proposals. Firstly, he suggested that the Central Committee be transferred to Cologne. He had opposed the suggestion made previously by Schopper that Cologne be made responsible for Germany, but now the division in London was so great that effective leadership could no longer be given from Britain. Secondly, the new Central Committee should make new statutes, since the original statutes of 1847 and the weakened ones of 1848 were neither up to date nor respected by large sections of the League. Thirdly, there should be 2 completely separate groups in London, both linked directly to the Central Committee in Cologne. This was necessary to preserve the unity of the League, for the views recently expressed by the minority showed that there were important differences of principle between the 2 groups. Marx continued a German national approach. Pandering to the nationalism of the German manual workers has replaced the universal approach of the manifesto. Will is put forward as the chief factor in revolution, instead of real relationships. We say to the workers, you have 15, 20, 50 years of civil war to go through to change the circumstances and fit yourselves for power. You say instead, we must gain power immediately or we can go to sleep. The word proletariat is now used as an empty word, as is the word people by the Democrats. To give this phrase any reality, all petty bourgeois had to be declared proletarians, which meant in fact that we were representing the petty bourgeois and not the proletariat. Marx concluded by saying that the majority would be within its rights in expelling the minority from the League, but that this would be detrimental to the interests of the party whose unity he had found a way of preserving while at the same time separating the 2 factions. There were at most 12 people he would like to see in his group, and he would naturally resign from the association. Schopper followed with an impassioned and rather inarticulate speech. He declared himself in favor of Marx's first 2 proposals but disagreed with the third, which he regarded as far too subtle. They should split into 2 leagues, one for those who work with the pen, the other for those who work differently. Finally, he could not accept that the bourgeoisie would come to power in Germany, as this robbed the proletarian movement of its whole purpose. Marx replied by insisting that his proposal ensured a complete separation while preserving the unity of the League. He then took up Schopper's point about the next revolution. If the proletariat came to power, it would employ measures that were petty bourgeois, not directly proletarian. Our party can only become the governing one when circumstances allow it to carry out its own views. Louis Blanc gives the best example of coming to power too soon. Moreover, in France it is not the proletariat alone but also the peasants and petty bourgeois who will come to power, and the measures taken will have to be common to them all, not those of the proletariat alone. After Recarius had supported Marx, Willich left the room without a word, and Marx's proposals were adopted, being supported by 6 out of the 10 possible votes. The Cologne group, having now achieved, with Marx's agreement, its ambition of being in charge of the League, was spurred to fresh activities, though the Willich-Schopper group probably commanded the loyalty of most of the League members in Germany. Marx duly got the new statutes accepted by a General Assembly of the London members. Thereafter he seems to have lacked enthusiasm for the League's activities and devoted himself more to economic studies. In May 1851, however, widespread arrests in Germany, which meant the effective end of the League's activities, compelled Marx to demonstrate his solidarity. The Prussian government had increased its campaign against subversive elements, following an attempted assassination of Frederick William IV in May 1850 and Kinkel's escape from prison the same year. Peter Nathjung, a journeyman tailor and a member of the Cologne Central Committee, was arrested in Leipzig while traveling on League business. On his person were found copies of the Communist Manifesto, Marx's March Address, the Cologne Address of December, the new statutes, and a list of addresses which enabled the authorities to arrest the 10 other members of the Cologne Committee. The prosecution was not at first successful. Following the arrests, 6 months of investigation revealed no more than that the accused were members of a propaganda society and failed to show any conspiracy or plot to overthrow the regime, and the judicial authorities in the Rhineland, who retained from the French occupation a more liberal legal system and an antipathy to Prussia, duly declared that there was not enough evidence to justify a trial. The result, however, was not release but further imprisonment. While the government's agent, Stieber, attempted to secure the necessary evidence, Marx set up a committee which collected money for the accused and organized letters from his friends to as many British newspapers as possible protesting against the imprisonment without trial. But public opinion was not impressed, the Times declaring that if the whole gang were treated as sturdy beggars instead of conspirators, they would be dealt with more according to their true characters. The trial was continually postponed during the summer of 1852, and when eventually it opened in October, the prosecution revealed the evidence it had been so long accumulating it amounted to nothing more than an attempt to associate Marx and the Cologne Communists with some of the more bizarre schemes of Willich's Paris friends, the principal exhibit being a notebook purporting to contain the minutes of meetings of the Communist League recently held in London under Marx's leadership. The notebook was a pure fabrication by one of Stieber's agents, helped by Hirsch, a former member of the League. No attempt had been made to initiate the handwriting of Liebknecht and Rings, the two supposed minute writers. In fact, Rings was the one member of the group who hardly knew how to write, and Liebknecht's initial was wrong. Marx made 2 trips to the police court in Marlborough Street to authenticate a sample of Liebknecht's actual handwriting and corroborate the testimony of the owner of the public house where they met, who was willing to confirm that no minutes were ever taken and that the dates of the meetings were in any case inaccurate. This and other information had to be sent off to the Defense Counsel in Cologne in several copies through cover addresses. Jenny Marx described the scene in their household. "My husband had to work the whole day right through into the night. The whole thing is now a battle between the police on one side and my husband on the other. He is credited with everything, the whole revolution, even the conduct of the trial. A whole office has been established in our house. 2 or 3 do the writing, others run errands, others scrape together pennies so that the writers can continue to exist and bring against the old official world proof of the unheard of scandal. In the middle of it all my 3 faithful children sing and pipe and often catch it from their dear father." Some business, their efforts succeeded in exposing the forgeries of the prosecution, but the jury nevertheless convicted the majority of the accused. "A degrading and completely unjust sentence," wrote the Prussian diplomat Varnhagen von Entz, who had no love for communists. The episode also had a frustrating sequel. During the trial, Marx had begun to write an article putting the main facts of the case before the public. Typical of Marx's drafts, this had grown into a small book to which he gave the title Revelations about the Communist trial in Cologne. As well as extensively documenting Prussian police methods, he publicized the split in the Communist League. For Marx felt compelled to dissociate himself from the plots and conspiracies of the Willich-Schopper faction. He explained that his group intended to build the opposition party of the future and would thus not have any part in conspiracies to produce immediate revolutionary overthrows. 2,000 copies, printed in Switzerland, were smuggled across the border into Prussia and stocked in a small village, but they were soon discovered and all confiscated by the police. The book was also published in America in a smaller edition, but very few copies found their way back into Germany. With the arrest of the Cologne Committee, the League ceased to exist in Germany in an organized form. The 15 to 20-strong London group had met regularly during 1851, first in Soho on Tuesday evenings, then in Farringdon Street in the city on Thursdays, and finally, during 1852, in the Rose and Crown Tavern, Crown Street, Soho, on Wednesdays. Marx presided, and the group was referred to by its members as the Synagogue or the Marx Society. Soon after the end of the Cologne trial, the League dissolved itself on Marx's suggestion with the declaration that its continued existence, both in London and on the continent, was no longer opportune. Willich's branch of the League ceased to function shortly afterwards. For the next 10 years Marx was a member of no political party. Refuge e politique s. Although the dissolution of the Communist League completed Marx's withdrawal from active politics, he continued throughout the 1850s to be an assiduous and often sarcastic observer of the various intrigues of the London refugees. Deprived of the possibility of engaging in national politics on their home ground, these refugees indulged in feverish political infighting in London, though the doctrinal differences between bourgeois Republicans and socialists were real enough. The result was a constantly changing kaleidoscope of plans, committees and alliances, not least among the largest group of refugees, the Germans, whose sects a bewildered Illersen compared in number to the 40 times 40 churches traditionally supposed to be found in Moscow. The feud in the Communist League only added to an already fragmented picture. Marx's supporters, with the exception of Liebknecht, who braved his anger, had withdrawn from the association in Great Windmill Street, but it continued to function under Willich's leadership, as did also the Willich Schapper group of the Communist League. This group, claiming to constitute the true Central Committee, expelled the Marx faction and declared in a circular to its members that we thought and still think that, given the right organization, our party will be able to put through such measures in the next revolution as to lay the foundation for a workers' society. The split made public by the unsuccessful prosecution of Bauer and Fander for the embezzlement of the association's funds was soon widened on the occasion of the Banquet of the Equals held in the Highbury Barn Tavern, Islington, on February 24, 1851, to celebrate the anniversary of the 1848 February Revolution. This banquet was organized by the socialist Louis Blanc in opposition to the radical banquet of Ledru Rollin. Blanc relied for support on the London Communists, and Willich presided at the banquet. Marx sent 2 spies, Piper and Schramm, but they were detected and thrown out with considerable violence, even losing in the process, according to Marx, several tufts of hair. This incident meant that, apart from the meetings of his group, Marx was isolated from the other refugees. Marx lives a very retired life, wrote Piper to Engels. His only friends are John Stuart Mill and Lloyd, and when you visit him you are received with economic categories instead of with compliments. Marx, however, professed to be quite pleased with this situation and wrote to Engels the same month, I am very pleased with the public and genuine isolation in which we two, you and I, find ourselves. It entirely suits our position and principles. We have now finished with the system of mutual concessions, with half-truths admitted for reasons of propriety and with our duty of sharing in the public ridicule in the party with all these asses. Nevertheless, Marx became withdrawn and somewhat embittered, pouring his scorn on his fellow refugees that knew no bounds. Willich in particular became the object of his biting irony, and descriptions like cowardly, slandering, infamous, foul assassin were typical. At the same time, Marx could not help seizing on every scrap of information concerning the refugees' activities and even occasionally personally indulging in the intrigues he so much despised. Late in 1850, for example, Schramm had written Willich a letter containing fantastic plans for revolution in Germany and inviting Willich to take charge. He signed it with the name of Hermann Becker of the Cologne Group. Willich fell into the trap and replied with bold plans for immediate revolution. Marx foresaw an excellent opportunity to ridicule Willich and attempted to get the letters from Willich, but without success. Marx's bitterness was increased by Willich's alliance with Jesus Christ Kinkel, as Marx liked to call him, who had arrived in London at the end of 1850, his prestige as a young revolutionary writer even further enhanced by a remarkable escape from his Prussian jail. Kinkel frequented the smart colony of German refugees in St. John's Wood, gave public lectures at a guinea a head, and soon earned enough money to present his wife with an Everard grand piano. More grandiose plans followed. In late 1851, Willich and Kinkel produced a scheme, inspired by Mazzini's highly successful Schilling Fund for European Democracy, for a German revolutionary loan to further the coming Republican Revolution, and Kinkel departed for America to publicize it. The target was $2 million, but only a few thousands were actually lent, which, after causing yet more dissension among the refugees, found their way into the vaults of the Westminster Bank in London to be used, years later, to help found the German Social Democrat Party. A brief attempt made in August 1851 to unite the refugees was unsuccessful, and the split remained between the two main factions, the radical Republicans led by Marx's old enemy Rouge, and the socialists led by Kinkel and W. Willich. At the end of 1851, the arrival of more refugees from Germany coincided with a growing dissatisfaction within the association over Willich's policies. The arrest of his Paris supporters and Napoleon's coup d'état made his revolutionary plans less and less plausible. Dissatisfaction was increased by Marx who, through Liebknecht, spread the rumor that Willich was concealing money destined for the refugees. In December, some workers who, with Marx's approval, had formed an opposition group in the Great Windmill Street Association, seceded and set up a new association with statutes drawn up by Marx. Its leader was Gottlieb Stecken, a tablemaker who had been one of the leaders of the Communist League in Hanover. Marx wrote to Weidmeier, "You can announce that a new workers' association has been formed in London under the presidency of Stecken that will steer clear of the émigrés, the agitators and Great Windmill, and pursue serious aims. You understand that this association belongs to us, although we are only sending our young people there. I am only speaking of our educated people, not of our workers who all go." This association contained about 60 members, and the organizing committee was in the hands of the members of the Marx Society. It met twice weekly in the Bull's Head Tavern, New Oxford Street, to discuss such questions as the influence of pauperism on revolution, whether a general war was in the interests of revolution, the advisability of cooperating with other revolutionary parties, and whether poverty could be abolished after the revolution. Piper and Liebknecht took a leading part in the discussions, though their didactic views were occasionally challenged by some of the workers. The association also provided English lessons, and in June the political discussions were replaced by a course on medieval literature given by Wilhelm Wolff. The association came to an end, however, in the late summer of 1852 when some of the workers, including Stecken himself, returned to the Great Windmill Street Association. During 1852, Marx was also occupied in writing a diatribe against his fellow exiles. Its history illustrates the bizarreness of refugee politics at this time. In February 1852, Marx was approached by a Hungarian colonel named Banya, whose acquaintance he had made 2 years previously when the Communist League was trying to enter into alliance with other revolutionary bodies. Banya came from a minor aristocratic family, had become an Austrian spy in 1850 and then went to Paris where he became vice president of a committee uniting Hungarian, Austrian and German political exiles, a committee of which 5 out of the 7 members were professional spies. Banya's contacts with Kinkel, Willich and Mazzini enabled him to keep Vienna very well informed, and he was instrumental in the arrest of the Cologne communists. He was also involved in the arrest of Willich's Paris friends in the autumn of 1851, was later arrested himself and contrived an escape to London. At his meeting with Marx there in February, Banya avoided party politics and promised Hungarian help for Weidmeier's paper. Marx was impressed and agreed to Banya's request for some short biographical sketches of the German refugee leaders to be used by the Hungarians in Paris. At the end of May, Banya informed Marx that he had found a German publisher willing to pay £25 for extended versions of the sketches. Marx did not suspect any trap. Banya had recently refused his invitation to attend a meeting of the Communist League and set to work. At first he was helped by Ernst Dronk, a former member of the staff of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, and later by Engels. Marx spent a month with Engels in Manchester in May when the final draft was composed. "We are crying with laughter at the pickling of these blockheads," Marx wrote to Jenny. Once the manuscript had been delivered, however, the publication date was repeatedly delayed. Banya's excuses sounded more and more implausible, and inquiries revealed that the publisher Banya had mentioned did not exist. Finally, Marx came to the conclusion that the manuscript had been sold to the authorities in Germany. In August 1852, a further episode occurred which showed to what lengths Marx was prepared to go in his vendettas against the refugees. The rumor had reached Marx that on his American trip Kinkel had referred to Engels and himself as 2 down-and-outs who had been thrown out of the London pubs by the workers. He wrote to Kinkel, "I await your explanation by return. Silence will be treated as an admission of guilt." Kinkel did reply by return that he wanted nothing more to do with Marx in view of Marx's article in the Review attacking him while still in jail. Marx should not, he continued, trust hearsay, but if he chose to do so, the due processes of law were open to him. Convinced that Kinkel would not look at anything with a Soho postmark, Marx got Lupus in Windsor to post a letter to him, written on paper in the shape of a billet doux with a bunch of roses and forget-me-nots printed on it in color. The letter named Marx's sources of information for the American venture and claimed that Kinkel's letter provided a new and striking proof that the said Kinkel is a common and cowardly priest. By the end of 1852, the feuds among the refugees began to cool off. Engels wrote that when he was with Marx at Christmas, we made a point of going without any fuss into the middle of the crowds in the Kinkel Willach Rouge pubs, which we would not have been able to risk without a brawl 6 months previously. Kinkel's popularity was on the decline since the relative failure of his American trip and the squabbles over the money. Willach's reputation was destroyed more swiftly. Baroness von Breyning, who held a salon for the German refugee leaders in St. John's Wood, alleged that Willach had made improper advances to her. He left for America very soon afterwards. His quarrel with Marx did not immediately cease, for Willach felt compelled to reply to the accusations against him in Marx's Revelations with a long article entitled, Dr. Marx and His Revelations, to which Marx responded with a sarcastic pamphlet, The Night of the Noble Mind. There the quarrel stopped. Willach became a journalist in Cincinnati, reviewed Marx's later writings favorably and studied Hegel. He was decorated during the Civil War, marched with Sherman to Atlanta, and left with the rank of Major General. He finally settled in St. Mary's, Ohio, where he became one of its most active and respected citizens, his funeral being attended by more than 2,500 people. Marx was not a man to pursue a quarrel interminably. He hesitated before including the section on the Willach shopper faction in the second edition of the Revelations in 1875, and wrote in the preface that in the American Civil War Willach demonstrated that he was something more than a weaver of fantastic projects, although the leaders of the different national refugee groups did, in contrast with the rank and file, mix quite freely with each other. Marx's contacts with them were very sparse. He had been in close touch with the Blanquists in 1850, but they sided with Willach when the Communist League split. Louis Blanc, whom Marx considered more or less an ally after 1843, had also gone over to Willach on the occasion of the February banquet. Marx did receive an invitation to a similar banquet the following year, but sent Jenny in his place. He was not impressed by her report of the dry meeting with the trappings of tea and sandwiches. The Italian refugee leader Mazzini was dubbed by Marx the Pope of the Democratic Church in Party Bus, and he criticized his policies in a letter to Engels as follows: Mazzini knows only the towns with their liberal aristocracy and their enlightened citizens. The material needs of the Italian agricultural population as exploited and as systematically emasculated and held in stupidity as the Irish are naturally too low for the phraseological heaven of his cosmopolitan, neo-Catholic ideological manifestos. It needs courage, however, to inform the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy that the first step towards the independence of Italy is the complete emancipation of the peasants and the transformation of their semi-tenant system into free bourgeois property. As for the other prominent refugee leader, the Hungarian Kossuth, Marx considered him a representative of an obscure and semi-barbarous people still stuck in the semi-civilization of the 16th century. The only national group with which Marx had any prolonged contact were the Chartists. By 1850, the slow process of disintegration that had affected the Chartist movement after its climax and failure in 1848 was already well advanced. At the same time, repressive government measures had radicalized Chartism, and among the two most influential of its radical leaders in the early 1850s were George Julian Harney and Ernest Jones. Harney was the orphan son of a Kentish sailor and had been in Chartist journalism all his life. Engels had met him as early as 1843 when Harney was editing the Northern Star. He was the most internationally minded of the Chartist leaders, and this, together with his republicanism, led to his forced resignation from the Star in 1850. He then started his own paper, the Red Republican, later renamed the Friend of the People, which in November 1850 published the first English translation of the Communist Manifesto of citizens Charles Marx and Frederick Engels. A similarity in outlook, combined with the fact that Harney had a mass following and a newspaper, induced Marx to attempt a close collaboration with him. But Harney was above all a pragmatist and, while willing to join Marx and the Blanquists in the World Society of Communist Revolutionaries, he was at the same time embarking on a course that was bound to estrange him from Marx. By the summer of 1850, Harney had become convinced of the necessity of allying the National Charter Association with the expanding, but not so radical, cooperatives and trade unions. The immediate cause of their estrangement was Harney's indiscriminate enthusiasm for the various refugee groups in London who could all rely on getting their views published in the Friend of the People. In February 1851, Harney's Catholicity went further. He attended an international meeting to commemorate the Polish patriot Byrne and gave the best speech of the evening. The meeting was supported by Louis Blanc and the Blanquists and held under the presidency of Schopper. Other the less radical Chartists, was favorably impressed by the relative success of Jones's paper and his meetings in 1853, and eventually contributed some articles himself, though the number of printing errors made him very reluctant to continue. When invited by Jones to sit in the Labour Parliament in Manchester in 1854, Marx sent what he himself described as an ambivalent reply, declaring that the working class of Great Britain has shown itself more capable than any other of standing at the head of the great movement which, in the final analysis, must lead to the complete freedom of labor. The organization of its united forces, the organization of the working class on a national scale, such I conceive to be the great aim which the Workers' Parliament has set for itself. In February 1855, the same troubles as 4 years previously threatened to recur when Jones tried to organize another banquet to celebrate the 1848 revolution. Marx let himself be persuaded to attend a meeting of the Chartist International Committee to prepare the banquet, but the idle chatter of the Frenchmen, the staring of the Germans and the gesticulations of the Spaniards, not to mention the recent election of Herzen to the committee, impressed him merely as pure farce. He was a supercilious and silent observer at the meeting, smoking excessively to compensate. He eventually declined the invitation to the banquet, though his name appeared on the handbill, on the grounds that all such meetings were humbug, that it could bring about renewed persecution of aliens, and finally that he had refused ever to appear in the company of Herzen because I have no intention of seeing old Europe renewed through Russian blood. In 1856, however, Marx did accept an invitation to attend a celebration of the anniversary of the founding of the People's Paper because, as he put it, the times seemed to me to be hotting up. And even more because I was the only one of the refugees to be invited. The refugees were thereby convinced that we are the only intimate allies of the Chartists and that, if we hold back from public demonstrations and leave it to the Frenchmen openly to flirt with Chartism, it is always in our power to reoccupy the position that history has already allotted us. Relations between Marx and Jones became strained when, in 1857, Jones began to cooperate with radical sections of the middle class in order to get wide support for electoral reform. This failed, however. In 1861, he moved to Manchester to practice as a barrister, and maintained friendly relations with Marx and Engels until his death in 1869. Life in Dean Street. A hasty reading of Marx's correspondence gives the impression that Marx's family difficulties were largely due to their living in the most grinding poverty, and Marx's own descriptions of his lack of funds appears to bear this out. The year 1852 seems to have been the worst. In February, already for a week I have been in the pleasant position of not going out because my coat is in the pawnshop and of not being able to eat meat because of lack of credit. In the same month Jenny wrote, everything hangs on a hair, and 10 slash at the right time can often obviate a terrible situation. In April Marx had to borrow money to bury his daughter. In September he gave a detailed description of the situation. My wife is ill, little Jenny is ill, Lenchen has a sort of nervous fever, I cannot and could not call the doctor because I have no money for medicine. For 8 to 10 days I have fed the family on bread and potatoes, of which it is still questionable whether I can rustle up any today. Naturally, this diet was not recommended in the present climatic conditions. I did not write any articles for Dana, because I did not have the penny to go and read newspapers. I had put off until the beginning of September all the creditors who, as you know, are only paid off in small sums. Now there is a general storm. I have tried everything, but in vain. The best and most desirable thing that could happen would be that the landlady throw me out of the house. At least I would then be quit of the sum of £22. But I can scarcely trust her to be so obliging. Also baker, milkman, the man with the tea, greengrocer, old butcher's bills. How can I get clear of all this hellish muck? Finally, in the last 8 to 10 days, I have borrowed some shillings and pence. This is the most fatal thing, but it was necessary to avoid perishing. From layabouts.in October, Marx had once more to pawn his coat in order to buy paper, and in December he wrote, in a letter to Kluss accompanying his revelations concerning the Cologne Communist trial. You will be able to appreciate the humor of the book when you consider that its author, through lack of sufficient covering for his back and feet, is as good as interned and also was and is threatened with seeing really nauseating poverty overwhelm his family at any moment. The next year complaints were not so numerous. But still several valuable things must be renewed in the pawnshop if they are not to be forfeit, and this is naturally not possible at a time when even the means for the most necessary things are not there. And in October, the burden of debt has risen so much, the most necessary things have so completely disappeared to the pawnshop that for 10 days there has not been a penny in the house. The pawnshop was an indispensable institution for the Marx household. It was also, on one occasion, a source of discomfort. Marx tried to pawn some of Jenny's family silver with the Argyle crest on it. The pawnbroker considered this so suspect that he informed the police, and Marx had to spend the weekend in prison before he could establish his bona fides. In the summer of 1855 more drastic measures were required, and Marx retired with his family to a manse house in Camberwell, partly to avoid Dr. Freund, who was prosecuting him for non-payment of a bill. He spent from September to December incognito with Engels in Manchester for the same reason. However, a closer examination of Marx's revenues gives the strong impression that his difficulties resulted less from real poverty than from a desire to preserve appearances. coupled with an inability to husband his financial resources. This is certainly what one would expect from Marx's incapacity to manage the large sums of money that he had previously received and was again to receive in the 1860s. On his arrival in London, Marx was quite prepared to rent a flat in Chelsea that was very expensive, more than twice the rent Marx eventually paid for a house when he moved out of Dean Street. It was the failure of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung review that finally reduced his income to nothing. He put a lot of his own money into the production of this journal, got virtually none of it back, and in October 1850 was obliged to ask Wedemeyer to sell all the silver, apart from a few items belonging to little Jenny, that his wife had pawned a year previously in order to buy her ticket to Paris. Luckily, he had some generous friends, and a simple calculation seems to show that in the year previous to the arrival of the first check from the New York Daily Tribune, presumably the year in which his income was at its lowest, Marx received at least £150 in gifts. Since this is only the money mentioned in surviving correspondence, the total sum was probably considerably more. It came from various sources. Engels and Marx's Cologne friends through Daniels were the chief contributors. Worth and Lassalle also gave sums. One of Jenny's cousins sent Marx £15, and Freilagrath gave Marx £30, which he had obtained on the pretense of urgent party needs from some friends who willingly aid our cause. Marx was insistent that this help should come only from his close friends. As Jenny said, "My husband is very sensitive in these matters and would sooner sacrifice his last penny than be compelled to take to democratic beggary." Indeed, he even refused Lassalle's offer to open a public subscription to publish his work on economics. In the early 1850s, the cost of living was in fact falling, and £150 was considered quite an adequate income for a lower middle-class family with 3 children. Freilagrath, whose family circumstances were similar to those of Marx, earned less than £200 a year and yet boasted that he had never been without the luscious beefsteak of exile. By 1852, Marx's financial position improved in that he had a regular income as London correspondent of the New York Daily Tribune. Although small in 1852, this amounted to £80 in 1853 and more than £160 in 1854. The revenue from the New York Daily Tribune dropped during 1855 and 1856, but Marx began corresponding for the Neue Oder Zeitung at the end of 1854 for about £50 a year. This was, of course, supplemented by Engels, and would until the arrival of large sums in 1856 have been a tolerable income, had it been carefully managed. But Marx was incapable of such management. He was, for example, quite unaware of what the New York Daily Tribune was paying him for months after he had agreed to write regularly for the paper. And for his biggest literary success in these years, his anti-Palmerston broadsheets, which initially sold 15,000 copies and went into a second edition, he did not manage to get a single penny. What did not help financially, and reduced the family's morale, was the necessity of keeping up appearances. Writing to Engels in 1852 about his hardships, he stressed their unimportance when set beside his fear that the muck will sometime end in scandal. And in the same year he wrote of a visit by Worth, "It is painful when one sits in muck up to the neck to have so fine a gentleman opposite oneself from whom one must hide the 2 shameful things." Marx's creditors were quite naturally angry in 1854 when he spent considerable sums on Jenny's trip to Trier, which necessitated all sorts of new outfits because naturally she could not go to Trier in tatters. In May 1856, Jenny inherited about £150 from an uncle in Scotland and went with her children to Trier to see her ailing mother, who died in July. She returned to London in September with an inheritance of about £120, which allowed the family to leave the evil, frightful rooms which encompassed all our joy and all our pain and move with joyful heart into a small house at the foot of romantic Hampstead Heath, not far from lovely Primrose Hill. When we slept in our own beds for the first time, sat on our own chairs, and even had a parlor with second-hand furniture of a Rococo style, or rather bric-a-brac, then we really thought that we were living in a magic castle. The house, 9 Graftonleris, which Marx rented for £363 a year, was a narrow, terraced building with 3 stories and a basement, making for 8 rooms in all. It was 3 miles from the city center and a brand new development area that was in a few years to be built right over. All the money went to paying off old debts and setting up the house. Typically, Marx did not even have enough money to pay the first quarter's rent, a presage of difficulties to come. The years spent in the Dean Street house were the most barren and frustrating of Marx's life. They would have embittered the most stoic of characters, and Marx, as he said himself, was usually not long-suffering. Soho was the district of London where most of the refugees congregated, being then as now very cosmopolitan and full of eating places, prostitutes and theatres. Dean Street was one of its main thoroughfares, long and narrow. It had once been fashionable but was now decidedly shabby. It was also in a quarter where there was much cholera, particularly in 1854, when Marx accounted for the outbreak because the sewers made in June, July and August were driven through the pits where those who died of the plague in 1688, I think, were buried. From 1851 to 1856 the Marx family lived in a flat on the second floor composed initially of 2 rooms until Marx rented a third for his study. There were always 7, and occasionally 8, people living in the 2 rooms. The first was a small bedroom and the other a large, 15 feet by 18 feet, living room with 3 windows looking out on the street. By January 1851 Marx was already 2 weeks behind with the rent for his landlord Morgan Kavanagh, an Irish author who sublet the rooms for £22 a year. A few months later Marx avoided eviction only by signing an IOU to his landlord, who the next year, after waiting for months for the rent, threatened to put the bailiffs in. There were no holidays until 1854 when Jenny and the children went to Seiler's villa in Edmonton for a fortnight before going on to Trier. Jenny did write, but without success, to one of the editors of the New York Daily Tribune in the hope that they might be able to provide a house for Marx, their London correspondent. It was only the death of Edgar, combined with the inheritance from Jenny's uncle, that enabled them eventually to move in 1856. The family regularly managed to get out to Hampstead Heath on Sundays, a very popular excursion with Londoners at that time. The Heath, then still in its natural state, was about 1.5 hours' walk from Dean Street, and they aimed to arrive there by lunchtime. Liebknecht has described the outing of the lunch basket of a volume unknown in London, which Lenchen had saved from their sojourn in Trier, contained the centerpiece, a mighty roast veal. Tea and fruit they brought with them, bread, cheese and beer, could be bought on the Heath. The march itself was generally accomplished in the following order. I led the van with the 2 girls, now telling stories, now executing calisthenics, now on the hunt after field flowers that were not so scarce then as they are now. Behind us some friends. Then the main body of the army, Marx with his wife and some Sunday guest requiring special attention. And behind these Lenchen with the hungriest of the guests who helped her carry the basket. After the meal they produced the Sunday papers they had bought on the road, and now began reading and discussing politics while the children, who rapidly found playmates, played hide and seek behind the heather bushes. There followed games and donkey riding, at which Marx amused the company by his more than primitive art of writing and by the fanatical zeal with which he affirmed his skill in this art. They returned, with the children and Lenchen bringing up the rear, singing patriotic German songs and reciting Dante or Shakespeare. Marx also liked to go out occasionally in the evenings. Sometimes, wrote Liebknecht, it even happened that we relapsed into our old students' pranks. One evening Edgar Bauer, acquainted with Marx from their Berlin time and then not yet his personal enemy in spite of the Holy Family, had come to town from his hermitage in Highgate for the purpose of making a beer trip. The problem was to take something in every saloon between Oxford Street and Hampstead Road, making this something a very difficult task, even by confining yourself to a minimum, considering the enormous number of saloons in that part of the city. But we went to work undaunted and managed to reach the end of Tottenham Court Road without accident. Their loud singing issued from a public house. We entered and learned that a club of odd fellows were celebrating a festival. Many toasts were exchanged, but when Liebknecht began to claim superior political intelligence for the Germans and Bauer alluded to English cant, fists were brandished in the air, and we were sensible enough to choose the better part of valor and managed to effect, not wholly without difficulty, a passably dignified retreat. However, the evening was not finished. In order to cool our heated blood, we started on a double-quick march until Edgar Bauer stumbled over a heap of paving stones. Hurrah, an idea! And in memory of mad students' pranks he picked up a stone, and clash! Clatter! A gas lantern went flying into splinters. Nonsense is contagious, Marx and I did not stay behind, and we broke 4 or 5 street lamps. It was, perhaps, 2 o'clock in the morning and the streets were deserted in consequence. But the noise nevertheless attracted the attention of a policeman who with quick resolution gave the signal to his colleagues on the same beat. And immediately counter-signals were given. The position became critical. Happily we took in the situation at a glance, and happily we knew the locality. We raced ahead, 3 or 4 policemen some distance behind us. Marx showed an activity that I should not have attributed to him. And after the wild chase had lasted some minutes, we succeeded in turning into a side street and there running through an alley, a backyard, between two streets, whence we came behind the policeman who lost the trail. Now we were safe. When Engels was in London staying with Marx, the two of them used to go out together. Once Engels wrote to Jenny apologizing for having led her husband astray, and was informed that Marx's nocturnal wanderings had brought him such a chill that he had had to stay in bed for a week. Life in the 3 rooms in Dean Street was extremely irregular. The following vivid description, which seems to be largely accurate, was written by a Prussian government spy in 1852, as father and husband. Marx, in spite of his wild and restless character, is the gentlest and mildest of men. Marx lives in one of the worst, therefore one of the cheapest quarters of London. He occupies 2 rooms. The one looking out on the street is the salon, and the bedroom is at the back. In the whole apartment there is not one clean and solid piece of furniture. Everything is broken, tattered and torn, with a half-inch of dust over everything and the greatest disorder everywhere. In the middle of the salon there is a large old-fashioned table covered with an oilcloth, and on it there lie manuscripts, books, and newspapers, as well as the children's toys, the rags and tatters of his wife's sewing basket, several cups with broken rims, knives, forks, lamps, an inkpot, tumblers, Dutch clay pipes, tobacco ash, in a word, everything topsy-turvy, and all on the same table. A seller of second-hand goods would be ashamed to give away such a remarkable collection of odds and ends.